Before there was central heating, Instagram breakfasts, or that suspiciously quiet hum of a refrigerator at night, there was the great frontier, a place where winters bit like an unpaid landlord and families slept so close together they knew what everyone had for dinner, by scent and by sound. Let's take a little journey now, back to the 18th and 19th centuries, America's frontier, a stretch of land that wasn't just wild, it was unbothered by modern conveniences. It was scenic, certainly, peaceful sometimes, but mostly it was chilly and damp and profoundly full of porridge. Imagine yourself in a one-room log cabin. The wind is politely hurling itself against the wooden walls. You're inside, wrapped in every smidge of fabric available, wool, cotton, flannel, and what might genuinely be a curtain. Babies are swaddled like prize potatoes. Parents have two jobs: survive the winter and not freeze into historic preservation exhibits. The family bed, a generous way of saying everyone slept in the same horizontal pile, was where the real action happened. Not that kind of action. We're talking about strategic snuggling. The rule was, smallest and squishiest children in the middle, older siblings flanking them, parents on the outer edges, playing Siberian border guards against the icy draft that always snuck in under the door. No matter how many quilts had been woven, layered, or whispered threats at. Now these early American homes didn't just lack insulation, they lacked rooms. The one-room cabin was multifunctional. Sleep quarters, cooking space, diaper-changing tranche de vie, frontier barbershop, and if Aunt Martha was staying, also a place of awkward silence and passive-aggressive quilt folding. At night, families would stir up the banked embers of the hearth. This was the life source. Not only did it heat the stew, the room, and, on enthusiastic nights, Dad's woolen socks drying above it, it also gave everyone rosy cheeks and a healthy respect for fire safety. Ashes were gently packed over the coals to keep them smouldering. This was called banking the fire. Frankly, it could be the difference between warm porridge in the morning or existential contemplation over cold oats. And speaking of oats, porridge wasn't just a food, it was a lifestyle. The reigning monarch of breakfast, lunch, dinner, and occasionally the off-peak 2 a.m. snack when someone couldn't sleep and remembered the pot was still warm. Frontier porridge was basically oats, water, a wish, and hope for trade goods. If you were lucky, a neighbor might share cinnamon, or, if they truly liked you, actual sugar. This would, of course, spark a frontier-wide celebration and 4 unsolicited marriage proposals. But while porridge simmered and fires crackled, comfort came in other forms. Quilts, for instance. These weren't the pastel Pinterest pretties of today. No. These were robust, down-filled, hand-stitched fortresses with names like log cabin pattern, bear's paw, and, I kid you not, drunkard's path. Usually sewn by candlelight, while someone read from a Bible the size of Nebraska. Quilting bees were social events, a chance to gossip, trade secrets, and complain about missing thimbles for the 9th time. And there, under these thick blankets, families would hear the gentle thud-thud of logs shifting in the hearth, the occasional frost fox barking outside, or possibly just Cousin Elias snoring, and the slow, sleepy rhythm of a household winding down. Of course, life on the frontier was not all cozy snuggles and pumpkin-colored sunsets. Mice were frequent roommates. Floorboards creaked louder than poorly tuned violins, and there was always one uncle convinced he could build a better chimney, and proceeded to smoke out the entire cabin trying. Yet despite, or perhaps because of, these humble, maritime of the forest conditions, the frontier was a place of closeness. Not just physical, though it was undeniably that, but emotional too. Families lived cheek to cheek, stew to spoon. Every drafty nail in the wall reminded them they were building, persisting, and most importantly, not frozen. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Curl in a little deeper now, just as the wind hushes and the last spark in the hearth sighs into ember. In the hushed stillness of a prairie evening, where the horizon stretched so wide it almost seemed to sigh, families huddled into their handcrafted little worlds, homes built not so much of ambition, but of survival and an impressive tolerance for drafty corners. The frontier cabin was not the log mansion of romantic myth. No wraparound porch with a wistful fiddle tune. No Mountain Dew poster nailed to the barn. No, sir. This was a one-room affair, and if you were lucky, it had a floor that wasn't made entirely of the earth politely pretending to be a rug. Inside, the heartbeat of home pulsed from the fireplace, a rough and ready hearth that doubled as stove, heater, light source, and symbol of whether this winter the family might wake up with facial frost. The entire structure was like a wooden thermos that leaked indiscriminately, warmed only by fire and familial body heat, which is far less glamorous than it sounds when you've got 7 people packed in like biscuits in a skillet. Sleeping arrangements were best described as strategically communal. The smallest children got the warmest spots, usually closest to Ma and Pa, or sometimes sandwiched between older siblings like sleepy little logs in a human Lincoln log cabin. The parents would sleep head to toes with the youngsters, not from quirky parental affection, but because someone had calculated that fewer noses pointing the same way meant fewer lungs breathing the same cold draft. It was thermodynamics, frontier edition. Beds were promoted bundles of whatever nature offered or didn't strongly protest being taken. Straw, old feathers, grass, or even corn husks, all jammed into ticking sacks. For those less blessed in the mattress department, a trundle was the solution, a sort of underbed drawer of dreams, which you pulled out at night and shoved back under the family's main bed when breakfast called. After some time, the trundle mattress developed what frontier scientists called child-shaped indentations and not entirely explainable smells. Blankets, luxuries, quilts passed down through so many generations they practically had seniority in the family. Every stitch carried a story, usually sewn by candlelight and with exclamations like, "You cut a hole in what blanket now?" Wool, homespun and heavy, often came directly off the family sheep, who were, by the way, regarded less as pets and more like slow-moving fabric processors with attitude. Clothing doubled as bedding. You wore what you wore to bed. Long underwear, socks, flannel. On a particularly chilly night, someone might sleep in their hat. This was not eccentric Western fashion. This was genuine, panicked insulation. And while nobody liked smelling like last week's stew, winter demanded that you become increasingly okay with smelling like things. There are diary entries, particularly from exasperated mothers, describing entire family units sleeping in shifts around the stove, like pioneers orbiting the sun, revolving for their chance at warmth before rotating out into the outer frontier of the room again. Pet dogs were cherished not just for their noble companionship, but also for their steady, snug heat output. If it barked and emitted warmth, it probably got to stay under the quilt. As night deepened and the winds outside spooled across the plains with a certain eerie icebox sigh, families would succumb to sleep not out of tranquility, but defeat. But there was a beauty to it. The shared, huddled closeness, the muffled laughter, someone's foot accidentally in someone else's ear, and the gentle crackle of logs that were possibly a little bit green and smoked more than they flamed. Yes, cold frontier nights were absurdly inconvenient, but they were also strangely lovely, with bodies stacked like socks in a drawer and dreams rising thin and wispy toward the low-beam ceiling. Families slept in sync. The cold wasn't a villain. It was simply the background character that made the hearth seem warmer, and the love, however cranky that love sometimes got, more human. And in the morning, when that same fire crackled to life again, it would kindle not just warmth, but the start of another day filled with bustling chores, strong coffee, and bacon fried in whatever pan hadn't been claimed by the cat. Speaking of bacon and breakfast, there's something rather charming in how they managed to eat, hunkered around tiny tables with wooden utensils and stronger opinions about cornmeal than most modern diners could ever understand. Across the sagging timbers of a prairie homestead, as twilight poured itself gently across the frost-bitten fields, there stirred the most vital question on the frontier. After survival itself, of course. Who gets the warm spot near the fireplace? Fireplaces, you see, were the heart of the home, not merely for ambience or marshmallow roasting, but because without them, you'd likely become an ice sculpture by morning. And while 19th century frontier families may have been rugged, they were also more than a little inventive when it came to staying warm and vaguely vertical through the long, stubborn nights. These homes were built with a kind of optimism only a family with frost-nibbled toes could muster. Log cabins, squat and sturdy, were chinked with a questionable mix of mud, moss, or, if you were feeling fancy, lime plaster. They had gaps you could see daylight through, and perhaps your neighbour's cow. The wind would whistle through the cracks like it had unfinished business in your living room. Now, let's talk about heating. In modern homes, you might tap a button and hear the sweet hum of central air. On the frontier, if you wanted heat, you lit a fire. If you wanted more heat, you moved closer to the fire. There were no wildly fluctuating thermostats, unless you counted the moment when the fire went out at 3 a.m. and you cycled instantly from warm to wolverine howling cold. The fireplace warmed the room in theory, but in reality, most of the heat escaped up the chimney like it was on the run. It was a sad but accepted truth of the time that the front would be toasty and the backside of the room as cold as pioneer in-laws. So families developed a highly democratic system of bed placement. Whoever was oldest, youngest, or sick, or in some cases, simply sneakiest, got the best spot by the hearth. At bedtime, the home transformed into a strange scene of synchronized settling. Straw mattresses were unrolled on the floor for the children, who would sleep in tangled rows like a litter of sleepy puppies. Mom and Dad claimed the one proper bed, an elevated wooden frame stuffed with straw, feathers, if they were lucky, and moral authority. Grandparents, if still alive and game, might be tucked into a nearby corner wrapped in every available quilt, scarf, and possibly the family cat. Speaking of livestock, it wasn't uncommon for smaller, more emotionally supportive animals, like chickens and goats, to share the general cabin space during harsher winters. Not exactly the spa weekend vibe, but nobody argued with the ambient heat of a sleepy goat curled under a bench. It was warmth. It was friendship. It was rural multitasking. Some frontier homes even had the luxury of a box stove, a cast iron contraption that both dazzled and threatened to sear your existence with one accidental brush. If the fireplace was the gentle glow of family hope, The box stove was the angry sibling who needed no poking to spit coals across the rug. But goodness, did it produce heat. Enough to toast your knees and dry damp mittens, which often steamed like cabbage until they were less mitten, more soup. Bundles of corn husks or old blankets served as temporary insulation in door frames and windows. Parents would tuck children into bed using the burrito method, which involved wrapping them tightly in blankets and hoping no limbs escaped until spring. Desperate times also inspired desperate fashion. Knitted nightcaps, woolen stockings, and all manner of homemade thermal contraptions that wouldn't survive a single day in a modern department store. And yet, within all this chilly improvisation, there was a peculiar kind of intimacy. The cold did not discriminate, so families relied on closeness, for warmth, for comfort, and likely for the ability to hear someone whisper urgently, "The fire's out again." Now, if you've never had the pleasure of rekindling a fire at 2 a.m. with freezing fingers and a half-alive candle stub, you haven't been properly inducted into frontier life. The lucky soul chosen for this frosty mission would tiptoe over creaking floorboards, pile on some kindling, whisper loving invocations to the flint striker, and pray the fire would catch before frost formed on their eyebrows. So went the night, the cabin a patchwork of breathing blankets, occasional midnight shivers, and the faint crackle of flame, coaxed into survival by sheer willpower and perhaps a little pioneer profanity. But where there is warmth, there's also something else: food. Not just from the fire, but because staying warm and being fed were two sides of the same frostbitten coin. And as flickers of morning started to edge through the frost-lined windows, the smell of something cooking, maybe cornbread or hope, would start to rise with the smoke. By the time winter settled its quilted weight over the frontier, families had already shifted into what you might call domestic hibernation mode. Life didn't slow down, mind you. It just got a lot more layer-based. Mittens of questionable origin were paired with socks that had long since lost their elastic dignity. Wool, the heroic and uncomplaining fabric of the cold months, clung to every limb like a faithful companion. And if there was a fireplace, that was now the closest thing to a sun anyone was going to see for weeks. Now, let us step into one of these frontier homes, and don't worry, you don't need snow boots. Just imagination and a fleece blanket will do. The average log cabin in the 1800s was snug, by which I mean cozily stuffed with humans and ambitions. 1 or 2 rooms at most, walls made of thick logs chinked with mud or moss, and drafty in places one didn't think drafts could reach. The entire structure creaked like an elderly sea captain with opinions about everything, and if it didn't groan during the night, someone would probably check to make sure it hadn't died of boredom. In this compact kingdom, the fireplace was the undisputed monarch. Positioned like a throne along the central wall, or, if you were fancy, the end wall, it served as stove, heater, nightlight, and conversation partner. Keeping a fire alive in it was both a craft and a chore, requiring a delicate mix of kindling, damp complaints, and sheer willpower. Children, cursed with surplus energy and highly flammable curiosity, were warned not to get too close to the fire, which, in frontier terms, meant closer than halfway across the room. This rule was often enforced by the mother of the house, who had 6 other tasks to do, while also preventing her toddler from attempting to roast their imaginary friend. Clothing during these icy months layered up like flaky pastry. People didn't change clothes so much as rotate through variations of slightly less damp. A man might go days in the same wool shirt, and his wife might go weeks in a dress whose neckline could double as an iron collar. Laundry was rare, mostly because washing involved breaking through ice with a blunt object and hoping you didn't fall in with your Pioneer socks still on. To keep warm in bed, everyone stretched the concept of personal space. Entire families slipped beneath a single mountain of quilts, woven from recycled cloth, sack scraps, and the whisperings of exhausted ancestors. Parents, children, and sometimes visiting neighbors would all huddle together, forming a sort of human lasagna with warmth as the only ingredient. Bed frames, if you had one, were likely handmade, with rope supports that needed tightening now and then. Hence the charming phrase, "sleep tight." These ropes would gradually sag, much like everyone's spine, after a long day of carrying water back from a frozen stream, uphill both ways. Pillows were stuffed with whatever combination of straw, feathers, or ambitions you had on hand. They were rarely comfortable, but they were certainly consistent. To further stave off the chill, people employed a clever tool that sounds cozy, but was practically a medieval weapon, the bed warmer. Imagine a small metal pan, filled with hot coals, attached to a long handle, and wielded under the covers like a sleepy time broadsword. It was gently slid between the sheets before bed, theoretically to warm the space and not set it ablaze. Sometimes it did both. The smell of lightly toasted bedding was, alas, not as romantic as it sounds. Perhaps most astonishing in those cold months was how frontier folk kept their spirits from freezing along with the water in their buckets. Storytelling was the linchpin of warmth. Tales by candlelight, whispered just before sleep, passed through generations like invisible blankets. Jokes, superstitions, ghost stories, all shared to keep the chill at bay and the heart a little brighter. And so, as the night stretched long and whispers turned to snores, life on the snowy frontier did not so much slumber as gently sigh into another frosty evening. Up ahead, through another draughty doorway and past the warming coals, lies the curious world of what and how people actually ate in winter, when even root vegetables needed a pep talk. Let's keep walking. Gently, as the frontier sun dipped behind a line of frosted pine trees, the log home began to creak with the familiar chill of another long night. The world beyond the wall of hand-hewn logs turned a dusky violet, and inside the scent of wood smoke, wool, and something roasted, hopefully food, but possibly someone's sock, settled like a blanket over the humble room. On the cold frontier, dinner was less of a formal event and more of a highly tactical maneuver against hunger. Think of it not as a meal, but as an edible skirmish waged bravely beside the fireplace. Frontier families didn't eat by candlelight for aesthetic reasons. It was the only light that didn't also freeze solid. If you've ever tried to butter bread while wearing mittens indoors, you'll understand the challenge. Most families relied on what the land grudgingly offered: root vegetables that could survive a nuclear event, salting and smoking techniques that could preserve a raccoon steak longer than some marriages, and cornmeal, gloriously reliable cornmeal, the duct tape of frontier pantries. With it, pioneers conjured everything from mush to johnny cakes to something they optimistically called pudding, though no dessert spoon should be subjected to such things. Meals were a communal affair, not just for warmth or emotional support, but because there were usually only 3 spoons and 5 cousins. Every bite was shared, though not always willingly. The oldest boy might have a few more potatoes by age privilege, while the baby may do with mashed whatever in a carved wooden bowl, also known as Dad's hat turned upside down. Kitchens were not rooms, but states of mind. Sometimes it was just a corner near the hearth, with a pot suspended from a fiercely loyal iron hook. Above the flames bubbled a brew of whatever hadn't gone bad yet. Turnips anxious to escape, carrots past their prime, and maybe, just maybe, a sliver of salt pork if the family had been blessed with good hunting or a truly lazy pig. Cutlery was minimal. Most people owned one knife, and yes, it doubled for eating, crafting, whittling, and on bad days, minor surgery. Forks were rarer than manners on a snowed-in Tuesday, and when they did appear, they might have only 2 tines, which are forks that auditioned but didn't get the part. Children ate with their hands, and even adults did, when no one important was looking. The 10-fingered shovel method was particularly effective for beans, and yet, in the flickering firelight, conversation flourished. This was when the family would recount the day's heroic acts of survival, how Ma wrestled the icy pump handle and won, how little Sarah glared down a raccoon in the chicken coop, and how grandfather finally completed his whittling project, a wooden spoon shaped like a smaller wooden spoon. It was during these meals that stories looped and braided like the long nights themselves. Eating was one way to stay warm, of course. Calories were currency in the winter. Bears hibernate full. Pioneers had to stay up and finish the stew. Once the pot was scraped clean and the youngest licked the ladle when no one was watching, or more accurately, when they were watching but chose love over discipline, the family moved to phase 2 of winter survival, heat hoarding. In the hazy afterglow of dinner, the hearth took on an almost sacred importance. It was a radiator, a stove, a drying rack for socks, and if you were lucky, a source of entertainment. There were no screens, unless you count the thin muslin over the lone window fluttering in the draught like a confused ghost. So families stared into the fire, its glow casting gentle illusions across the walls, some claiming to see horses, faces, or the shape of South Dakota, though no one was quite sure where South Dakota was yet. Then there were the heated stones. Oh yes, large, smooth rocks would be plucked from the fire with metal tongs and wrapped in cloth like they were cradling the world's angriest baby. These makeshift radiators were tucked into bedding or passed around like warm potatoes of peace. Some families even placed them beneath cribs to keep infants toasty, and possibly alarmed. It was not glamorous, but it had its comforts. The slow thrum of the fire, the rhythmic pickings of a banjo if someone had one, and someone else hadn't secretly burned it last Tuesday. And the lull of bellies, finally, blissfully full. As wind whispered through the chinks in the log walls and breath puffed visibly in circlets of warm fog, the family settled deeper into the wool-clad hush of evening. Tomorrow would bring chores, smoke, and frost. But for tonight, they'd fought the cold frontier with cornbread, courage, and the communal body heat of people who had long since given up on personal space. And just as the candle's tongue bobbed low, nearly disappearing into its own pool of wax, little Sarah blinked sleepily up at the ceiling, wondering, was that raccoon still out there? The frontier was quiet now, and the stories had only just begun to stir. By the mid-19th century, the American frontier had all the warmth of a windswept cracker, thin, dry, crumbly, and prone to sudden snapping. The homesteads scattered across the prairie were less like cozy cottages and more like brave wooden boxes regularly tested by the whims of weather and wildlife alike. And when the sun dipped below the horizon, along with every degree of ambient warmth, families had to rely on a variety of cunning, if slightly itchy, methods to stay warm through the frosty evenings. First, there was the fire, Ah, the beloved hearth, the clattering heart of the frontier home. The fire wasn't just for ambience. It was the Wi-Fi router, coffee machine, central heating unit, and security alarm, all rolled into one noisy, sparking blaze. But managing a fire was no easy, poetic affair. It burned wood, not feelings or metaphors, and wood had to be chopped, split, hauled across snow-covered ground, and then fed, constantly, like a toddler with a charcoal addiction. Families often designed their homes so that the fireplace sat in the center, letting maximum heat radiate outward like a kind of slow wooden microwave. Many cabins had only one room, so the entire family lived, cooked, played, argued, studied, and snored within elbow-nudging proximity to the flames. Soot-covered ceilings and singed pajamas were just part of cozy domestic life. Nobody complained if their nightshirt had a light, smoky finish. It was considered aromatic. The conversation of where exactly to sleep in that one room became a frosty debate each winter. Usually, the eldest, frailest member, the porridge person, let's call them, got the prime real estate right by the hearth. Children, meanwhile, were often arranged like firewood themselves, tightly packed into shared beds or laid out on the floor in reorganizable configurations. Siblings slept toe-to-toe, sometimes with a heated brick wrapped in cloth at the foot of the bed. This was referred to as a bed warmer, although mildly charred foot risk might have been more accurate. And then there were quilts. Heavy, thick, lovingly stitched quilts, made from every last scrap of fabric no longer suitable for daylight appearances. Frontier patchwork was essentially a stitched-together biography of the family's entire wardrobe history. That blue square, once Pa's wedding shirt, the red one, remnant of Ma's Christmas apron, tragically stained by jam, and that odd, wildly striped patch, a failed experiment with homemade dye involving walnuts, despair, and one extremely angry chicken. These quilts weren't just warm, they were weighted with both fabric and sentimentality, the latter being surprisingly effective insulation. People slept under stacks of them, sometimes so heavy it made turning over an ordeal requiring advanced planning and cooperative effort. Children became tiny, quilted burritos. Adults woke up in the same position they'd fallen asleep in, unless they'd managed to dislodge themselves via strategic sneezes or the nocturnal kicking of a younger sibling. If you were extremely lucky or slightly better off, you might sleep on a straw tick mattress. Tick, in this case, referred to the tightly woven fabric casing, not the insect that historically followed around cows, dogs, and sometimes entire empires. These mattresses were filled with straw and had to be refluffed regularly, lest they become sad, flat sacks of discomfort that crunched ominously whenever you moved. And if you truly wanted to get toasty, you introduced the fur factor. Frontiers folk, particularly in colder regions, made use of anything that had once lived in the wild and now politely offered its pelt in the name of human comfort. Bears, wolves, raccoons, and even buffalo hides were spread on beds, draped over shoulders, or fashioned into impressively dramatic sleeping cloaks. Nothing says bedtime quite like tucking yourself into bed, wearing a bison overcoat, and hoping you remember to remove the antlers come morning. Of course, with the fire fading and the wind sneaking through every knothole and chink between logs, people did what they'd always done, relied on each other's warmth. Human body heat, as it turns out, was one of the frontier's most effective heating systems. Children were excellent for insulation, small, wriggly heat generators with built-in snores. And so were dogs, who would curl themselves into a familial coma at the foot of the bed, or, sometimes, directly on your chest. Thus, families survived the winter nights through a combination of fire, fur, accidental spooning, and a marvelously low bar for luxury. Comfort was measured not in thread counts or mattress firmness, but in whether or not your socks had frozen stiff by morning. And as fires turned to embers and dreams settled into blankets of snow outside, there was still the quiet middle-of-the-night question faced by every person on the prairie. Is it worth getting up to use the chamber pot, or should I just wait till sunrise and hope for the best? Speaking of sunrise, let's follow the warmth of the morning as it prepares to stir the cook stove from its slumber, and see what's for breakfast once the frost is scraped from the skillet. As winter blanketed the frontier in a thick quilt of silence and snow, families turned their attention to an ancient, vital art form rarely mastered and often misunderstood, staying warm without modern luxuries, or, as they called it then, staying alive with mild discomfort. The fireplaces were the heart of the home, quite literally, in the way a single candle is technically the heart of a very large, very draughty cave. And these hearths, oh, these noble fireplaces, they sputtered, smoked, and did their best to puff out heat like an asthmatic dragon. Built with good intentions and inconsistent results, they were usually brick-lined and centrally located when symmetry allowed. But so often, the placement of a fire was based less on concepts like efficiency and more on which way the wind might confuse the chimney less. At mealtimes, the fire worked double duty because nothing says cozy dinner like cooking your stew in the same flames that are desperately trying to keep your eyebrows unfrozen. Pots were hung from iron cranes that swung into and out of the fire with satisfying creaks. Metal arms that performed a beautiful ballet with charred choreography. Bread could be baked in a Dutch oven buried in hot coals, and there was always a pot of water simmering. Half tea, half optimism. But food and fires were only half the battle. The greatest insulation in a frontier cabin wasn't wood or wool. It was proximity. Body heat, that great unsung hero, was the frontier's most consistent central heating system. Provided, of course, your central wasn't shy about personal space. Come nightfall, the entire family would cluster together with the dignity of penguins in a blizzard. Children piled into rope-strung beds filled with straw or hay, scratching at their dreams and each other. Parents slept under quilts sewn from any scrap of available cloth, flour sacks, worn shirts, and occasionally that curtain you'd promised to mend 3 months ago. Heating the actual air in the cabin was a bit of a lost cause. It slipped out through the cracks quicker than a teenager avoiding chores. So people focused on heating themselves. Hot bricks or stones, warmed by the fire, were carefully wrapped and tucked into beds like honorary cousins. They weren't particularly chatty, but they did their job without complaint. Some families sealed off rooms entirely in winter, choosing to live in just one room to share the heat like it was gossip. Doorways were covered with thick curtains, not for drama, but for draft control. Windows, when they existed, were often stuffed with rags or paper, even newspaper, which offered warmth and, as a bonus, the previous year's weather report. Now, not all homes had technology as advanced as a fireplace. Some had stoves, those iron marvels that looked like squat metal beetles and hissed contentedly if kindly treated. The potbelly stove became a legend in its time, distributing warmth in unpredictable bursts, making the person closest to it sweat like midsummer and freezing anyone more than 2 feet away. It was democracy in its rawest form. Heat for the bold, frost for the shy. Blankets were layered like geological strata, quilt on quilt. with maybe a fur or two thrown in, preferably a bear if Aunt Mabel hadn't used it to patch her Sunday boots. Wearing nightcaps wasn't a fashion choice so much as an emergency scalp preservation tactic. People didn't just go to bed. They armored up for battle against the icy tickle of the second hour before dawn. Inside the logs and stone, as wild winds howled and snow buried the tips of fence posts, these homes glowed dimly with firelight and quiet resolve. Perhaps a pipe smoked slowly by the hearth as a grandfather read by lantern, words curling into the air like tendrils of warmth. Children fell asleep to the sound of creaking wood, shifting ice, and the soft respiration of bodies squished slightly closer than they would have preferred. And when morning came, so did the ritual, the shivering dash across the icy floorboards to relight the fire, teeth chattering Morse code for, "Why do we live like this?" Yet still, they rose. Porridge was stirred. Socks were grudgingly found. The day began again, in a home that was never quite warm, yet never quite cold enough to be called unwelcoming. And so the frontier slept, bundled and brambled in wool, wood smoke, and whispers. Outside, the cold reigned, but inside, where duct tape hadn't yet been invented and corking was an abstract ideal, people kept warm with close quarters, thick blankets, and the shared wisdom of how to make do. But warmth was only one piece of the frontier puzzle. When morning light seeped through frosted glass and tiny feet touched freezing floorboards, another battle began. One involving wooden utensils, dwindling rations, and the great unifying question, what's for breakfast? By the time twilight smeared its lavender fingers across the sky and the wind began its nightly whistling performance through every gap in the wooden shingles, the frontier family was already thinking about fire. Not the passionate kind, though I'm sure Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker had their moments, but the kind that involved wood, smoke, and a desperate plea for not freezing to death by dawn. Warmth on the American frontier was less about comfort, more about survival, and rarely about personal space. You see, the cozy image we conjure of a fire crackling merrily in a stone hearth, while the family sips mulled cider and crochets presents for the neighborhood squirrel. That was mostly a luxury for folks who lived within 100 miles of a riverboat or had the money for finished wallpaper. The average settler cabin had neither. What it did have was one fireplace, stubborn ambition, and enough smoke to flavor every meal, whether you wanted it or not. Now, let us gently tiptoe into the matter of fuel. Wood was the currency of warmth, chopped laboriously by hand and hoarded like it was gold wrapped in bark. Boys as young as 7 were handed axes half their size. They'd vanish into the woods and return with sunburned cheeks, a scratched up face, and something that could be classified as kindling if you squinted generously. Trees were felled, split, stacked, and cursed at with alarming frequency. Firewood is the frontier's most honest relationship. One letter from a Kansas settler read, "You put effort in, and at least it doesn't gossip about you." The fireplace itself was more of a fiery compromise than a heating solution. Pierre L'Enfant may have designed a famously elegant Washington, D.C., but your average settler's hearth had been arranged by someone with a grudge against right angles. Bricks were rare. So many resorted to sandstone, adobe, or if all else failed, clay reinforced with hysteria. The smoke should, in theory, rise up and out of the chimney. In practice, the smoke often traveled horizontally across the room first, introducing itself personally to nostrils, eyes, and dinner, before eventually meandering outward when it remembered what a chimney was for. On exceptionally cold nights, The entire family might gather near the hearth like mismatched marshmallows. Sleeping arrangements became a heated, literally, topic. Priorities were clear. The grandparents, if still mobile, got the side closest to the warmth. Toddlers and infants were tucked near mothers, not just for comfort, but for the practical reason that babies are terribly inefficient at stoking fires. Teenage sons, those lanky, groaning creatures, were often relegated to the outer edges of the room, or even to the attic, where the warmth was theoretical, but the mice were genuine. Some frontier folk, captivated by curiosity, or perhaps driven by pure frostbite, turned to alternative heating methods. Hot stones were warmed in the fire, then wrapped in cloth and placed beneath blankets. They worked decently if you enjoyed being gently scalded on one side while the rest of your body remained an icicle. Early bed warmers, like pans filled with hot coals slid between the sheets, were both ingenious and highly flammable, making each bedtime a thrilling gamble between sleep and spontaneous combustion. In communities with a stronger sense of morale or shared delusion, neighbors would sometimes huddle together during deep coal spells. Families packed into a single cabin, sleeping in rotating shifts beside the fire. Gossip was the currency of entertainment, and Uncle Tip's snore, so legendary it had once frightened a mule, became the subject of comedy more than complaint. Of course, ventilation was a secondary concern, as fresh air tended to be both cold and discouraged. Windows, when present, were often sealed with paper or oiled cloth, which did a stellar job of letting the light in while keeping the air uncomfortably thick with the essence of stew, smoke, and livestock dander. No frontier diary ever waxed poetic about the aroma of an unwashed cousin by the 5th day of winter. At its heart, warmth was something of a group project. You contributed wood, breath, body heat, and tolerances for snoring that you didn't know you had. Every ember in that hearth was a testament to blistered hands, frozen mornings spent splitting logs, and a kind of resilience that makes the modern central heating unit look positively lazy. But as the fire popped and hissed in the heart of the little cabin, casting shadows that danced like old tales on the walls, people settled into sleep. Yes, the floor was hard. Yes, the air still held the sharp spice of dried onions and singed hair. But there was comfort in the shared effort, the gathered warmth, and the whispered noises of a family dozing through another winter's eve. And when warmth was finally found, for however short the night, it invited dreams not just of tomorrow's chores, but perhaps, of thinner firewood and thicker walls. Something we'll lumber gently toward as we step into the rhythm of the frontier's next great secret. As winter unfurled its vast white empire over the American frontier, the hearth became not just the heart of the home, but something of a Renaissance woman, warming bodies, feeding bellies, drying socks, and sometimes offering sponge baths in a large tin tub, too intimate for polite conversation. If the frontier had a celebrity, it was the fireplace. Not glamorous, mind, but endlessly useful. Like if Meryl Streep were also an electric blanket and a soup pot. Now, warming up a home in the 1800s wasn't as easy as clicking a thermostat or arguing with your smart speaker. Alexa, raise cabin temperature would have probably summoned a bear or a very confused neighbor. So instead, families relied on ingenuity, muscle, and a mild level of fire hazard. The fireplace blazed with logs, often hand-split, hauled through snowdrifts, and stacked outside like flammable trophies. A good woodpile was both a survival mechanism and, unintentionally, the frontier's answer to curb appeal. Inside the cabin, the cold was a bit of a persistent roommate. It lurked in the corners, slithered under doors, and iced the insides of windows into frosted stained glass every morning. To counter this, savvy settlers deployed every available textile. Rugs on the floor, the walls, the ceilings if they could reach. Curtains, layered like lasagna. They stuffed muslin into every crack until it looked like the cabin had been casually upholstered. Even old clothes, particularly socks with too many holes for polite society, were drafted into service as door snakes. Frontier folk wore layers with the dedication of an onion. Wool under linen, linen under hides, hides under disappointment at how cold it still was. At night, families piled together under patchwork quilts so thick they achieved small-scale tectonic pressures. Quilts, by the way, were less fashion statements and more acts of engineering. Old clothes reincarnated into bedding, stitched meticulously during the quieter, albeit equally frozen months. One might sleep beneath a great-uncle's trousers and no one would dare bat an eye. Warmth by proximity was no myth. It was the most reliable heating system they had. Bodies snuggled close, children with cold noses pressing into warm parental ribs, dogs curled in fox-like circles at feet, everyone in a grand, heavy tangle of survival affection. Yes, even the cat, disdainful by day, fuzz therapist by night. Now and again, someone would try to innovate. The foot warmer, for example, was a wondrous invention. A small metal box filled with embers set underneath carriage seats or beneath dining tables. At night, these miniature furnaces were slipped under the covers like secret dragons. They also carried a generous risk of scorching your bedding or your dignity. But frontier life was full of such spicy gambles. Interestingly, many cabins had only one room, meaning the warmth of the fireplace had to stretch itself like a very tired teacher across an entire class of drafts and chilly corners. Kids slept farther away, nearer to windows with glass so thin it giggled at the idea of insulation. So, naturally, they often woke up with frost melting on their eyebrows, and the uncanny talent of sleeping in woolen socks, mittens, and, on more than one desperate occasion, a fur hat almost bigger than their whole head. The morning ritual was synchronized and brisk. Someone, usually the one who lost a non-verbal game of who moves first, would rise and dash to rekindle the fire under a breathy cloud of visible regret. Firewood was brought in with urgency and dread. If the kindling was damp, which it always was by some cruel law of physics, the entire family would huddle in blankets and offer helpful suggestions to the designated lighter of flames, such as, "Did you blow on it?" Or, "Why don't we just move to Bermuda?" And once the fire finally took, once the logs caught and spat their resinous applause, the cabin would fill with the sounds of stretching, the rustle of layered clothing being negotiated, and the smell, earthy, smoky, slightly singed, of another day warming up from the bottom of the thermometer. Breakfast was still to come, though whether that included eggs, cornmeal mush, or simply a hot cup of "don't ask what this is," depended largely on luck and what had survived the cellar rats. Sleepily now, you can feel the weight of quilts, the glowing flicker of firelight on rough-hewn beams, and perhaps a gentle snore from a dog curled near your toes. The night remained cold, yes, but ingenuity, community, and a certain cozy stubbornness made it something more than bearable. Almost magical, if you didn't have chilblains. Next, we'll quietly drift toward the long wooden table where breakfast was more than a meal. It was a survival strategy, often involving corn. Quite a lot of corn, different kinds, even unexpected corn. but we'll get there gently. After all, it's still dark outside, and you're still wrapped up warm. Now, picture a log cabin on a frost-bitten prairie. Firewood stacked like edible Lincoln logs near the hearth, and one window peeking out onto the snow-covered plains like a sleepy eye refusing to fully close. Inside, the frontier family has already survived another day of chopping, carrying, boiling, milking, fixing, sweeping, twisting, and something euphemistically called hog rendering, which, to be delicate, we'll say, was neither a ballet nor a tea party. But now comes the most strategic moment in frontier survival: where to put your backside when the mercury's dropped faster than a startled opossum from a fence post. Furniture, in the typical frontier household, wasn't just sparse, it was practically imaginary. If there was a rocking chair, it was often claimed by the elder of the house, a prize seat closer to the fire and dignified like a throne, but a throne with a creak that could wake the neighbor's mule 2 counties over. Most others sat on benches, crates, or what one hopeful soul might have labeled a chair, but what was clearly just 3 legs and some wishful thinking. The key to surviving the sharp-teethed cold of those evenings wasn't just wool socks and one unfortunate shared chamber pot. It was intelligent, layered togetherness. The hearth wasn't merely for cooking. It functioned as central heating, family gathering hub, storytelling amphitheater, sock drying station, impromptu ironing board for that one shirt someone had to wear to town, and, in desperate moments, a place to gently toast one's posterior like a human marshmallow. Families ate dinner with the urgency of people who knew if the stew cooled, it might freeze solid, with the spoon still stuck upright. Meals were simple by necessity. Cornbread that could double as a projectile weapon in case of raccoons. Beans that had been boiled 12 ways to tomorrow, and coffee, endlessly reheated, eternally gritty, brewed so strong it could stand on its own and offer unsolicited advice. Children, when not playing their favorite winter game, Is That Frostbite?, helped carry in firewood or churn butter with the solemn purposefulness of monastic scribes. Firewood stacking itself was not just survival, it was social hierarchy. Those who could stack it without toppling earned bragging rights for days. Entire courting rituals may or may not have begun over particularly symmetrical wood piles. And then, as dusk thickened and the wind stitched itself around the corners of the house, bedtime rituals began. Not silent, candlelit serenity, mind you, but the tactical orchestration of bedding arrangements that would make a seasoned general weep with admiration. Beds were shared out of necessity, not affection. A family of 7 might occupy 2 feather-tufted rectangles and a pile of hay, bundled together like cinnamon rolls under quilts heavy enough to cause mild claustrophobia. Foot warming was delicate science. Hot rocks wrapped in cloth, flannel pouches filled with baked beans, reused before eating not recommended, and the rare luxury of a brick from the hearth slipped under the sheets just before lights out. These were the heroes of the frontier evening. To have warm feet in bed was to have hope. To place bare toes against someone else's unsuspecting leg in search of heat, that was cause for lifelong grudges. Parents, even in their exhaustion, often ended the day reading aloud from the family Bible, a well-thumbed almanac, or, if particularly lucky, a novel sent from back east. These readings were less about literacy and more about rhythm, a slow, steady murmur over the crackling fire that lulled children and adults alike into dream space. Because on the frontier, the difference between a tale well told and a sleepless night was as thin as the cabin walls themselves. Occasionally, A particularly dramatic wind would rattle the chinking between logs just enough to flutter the edge of a blanket, sending a ripple of groans and sleepy curses through the room. Someone would grumble about needing to check the fire. Someone else would suggest just ignoring it and hoping for dawn. But the brave soul would rise, scoop another log into the chimney's hungry mouth, and return to bed a hero, or at least a very cold statue of one. Which brings us, gently, to the matter of maintaining that heat overnight, and whether keeping a fire burning till morning was bravely efficient, or a one-way ticket to sleepy combustion. Perhaps we should stoke that question next. As the wind howled across the barren plains and clawed at the cracks in the cabin's chinking, frontier families had their own secret weapon to fend off the cold. Layers of wool shared body heat, and most charmingly, whatever livestock hadn't been asked to sleep outside that night. While modern sensibilities may flinch at the idea of a goat near the hearth or a hen tucked under the bed, on the frontier, practicality trumped propriety. A family's survival in winter often depended less on polite decorum and more on whether the cow's breath could fog up the tiny window pane. Sleeping arrangements on the frontier were rarely what you'd call privacy-friendly. The standard log cabin, built with enthusiasm and very little insulation, typically boasted a single room in which all the essentials of life happened: cooking, eating, mending, arguing about whose turn it was to fetch water, and yes, sleeping. Beds were valuable, but also remarkably democratic. If there were more bodies than beds, which was often the case, children slept spooned like firewood on straw pallets, or in drawers if they were particularly small, quiet, and agreeable. That last part was negotiable, and no one complained too much about snoring. It was simply another charming acoustical element, alongside the rustle of mice, the crackle of logs, and the occasional grunt from the pig bedded down in the corner barn room. A lullaby of survival. Quilts were family heirlooms not just because of their intricate stitching, but because they were essential survival gear. Layered thick, often made from the worn-out garments of 3 generations, they held stories and stitches in equal measure. Underneath them, people slept in groups. Siblings nestled together like squirrels, parents forming the protective hillocks on either side. In more refined moments, some families boasted a trundle bed, a little rolling miracle that slid beneath the main bed during the day and rolled out at night like a wooden drawer full of dreams and giggles. It didn't matter that the mattress was often a sack stuffed with corn husks or hay. The cozy rituals of bed-making transformed these humble materials into something closer to magic. Firewood was currency, and managing it was the family's eternal winter sport. Each log had to be split, hauled, and treated with almost mystical reverence. At night, the final ember banked beneath the ashes was a tiny flicker of hope, left ready for the pre-dawn rekindling. No one wanted to face the wrath of waking to a frozen water bucket, indoors. Yes, indoors. By the soft, sputtering glow of tallow candles or a kerosene lamp, nightly routines took place in hushed tones. The fire would be fed once more, the ashes stirred just so. Children listened as stories took shape in the smoky air, perhaps about relatives back east, or the humorous misadventures of a cow that tried to escape milking duty. These bits of evening storytelling weren't just entertainment. They worked like a cozy thread, quilting the chaos of the day into something soft and shared. And then there were socks. Woolen, scratchy, off-darned socks, line-dried to a stiffness that could stand up on their own. To be in possession of 2 good socks in winter was a form of spiritual wealth. Slipping them underneath the covers cold feet slowly thawing in the shared warmth of the family bed, was as close to a religious experience as many frontier folks would like to admit. Of course, morning came with its own brand of adventure. Windows fractal with frost, air so biting you could see your breath echo back at you. It often fell to the eldest child to leap from bed, a heroic act, stumbling toward the hearth to resurrect the fire with sleepy indignation and a few mumbled curses, all before breakfast had dared to simmer over the flames. But in between those harsh awakenings and the nighttime battle against cold, there were quiet, golden moments, nests of warmth, whispered laughter beneath quilts, and the communal weariness that made even the hardest of beds feel like a sanctuary. And just beyond the wavering light of the hearth, beyond the frost-rimmed windows, lay the next morning's unknowns, another day of making do, of finding joy in hard bread and harder living. But first, there was sleep, a sleep earned, shared, and on especially frigid nights, accompanied by the occasional bleat from a sheep who knew too well the value of a warm room. As the embers hush to a gentle glow and the winds begin to quiet against the walls, we drift now to another space in this woven frontier life, where meals were often shared from one pot, and the clink of a wooden spoon echoed like a chapel bell amid laughter and long hunger. By the time winter snuck its frostbitten fingers beneath the splintered doors of a frontier cabin, the family inside had long since become professionals at holding back the cold. Not through any act of high science, mind you, but through the purest, oldest human tactic available: collective, slightly awkward togetherness. Most frontier homes, a generous word for what was often some logs, mud, and hope, had one room. Just one. No bonus rooms, no quaint breakfast nooks, and certainly no separate bedrooms with cheerful little lamps. There was a fireplace, if you were lucky, and remarkably good at not burning your house down. And in front of that, every warm-bodied creature piled in like mismatched socks in a drawer. Parents, children, the neighbor's kid, who got snowed in 3 nights ago, and perhaps dog with a guilty conscience. Now, staying warm at night was a full-contact family sport. Beds were rarely private affairs. They were shared by necessity, and not always among those of similar snoring volumes. In the deeply frosty dead of winter, a bed might house as many as it physically could. You slept not facing into the night like in some noble oil painting, but likely crammed against your cousin's elbows, a baby's foot in your ear, and your own knees somewhere north of their usual coordinates, all in the name of body heat and survival. Frontier families knew how to bundle. Quilts weren't just decorative. They were wool-stuffed battlegrounds against the cold, stitched together over the course of many candlelit evenings with silent promises that yes, this drafty cabin would indeed survive another howling January. Layers were everything. You wore your long johns to bed, sometimes 2 pairs. Should someone fire up the phrase air conditioning within 500 paces of a settler's widow, they risked getting swatted with a stocking cap and excommunicated from the root cellar. Heating the cabin overnight was a rather theatrical combination of effort, prayer, and reluctant midnight log tending. The fireplace, typically made from local stone and bound with equal parts ash and ambition, needed feeding. Throughout the night, one unlucky soul, often the father or the child who'd recently overfed the mule, would slouch out of bed to poke the fire, add a log, and try not to ignite any siblings on the return stumble. During cold snaps, when frost painted the inside walls, and even the dog looked offended, settlers sometimes brought barn animals indoors. Chickens roosted in corners, goats lounged near the hearth, and one historical account records a particularly affectionate pig who reportedly slept next to a child and snored so harmoniously that he was mistakenly tucked in every night. Even the very walls tried their best. Homes were chinked, that is, the cracks between logs were stuffed with clay, straw, moss, or whatever seemed most plausible, creating a patchwork insulation system that was equal parts nature and desperation. Some families maintained an ever-evolving collection of rags and old clothes tucked around windows and doors, like sleepy little sandbags against the winter tide. And then there was food, or rather, the pursuit of any excuse to cook. Kitchens weren't separate spaces, they were wherever the fire was. Cooking wasn't just nourishment, it was daily climate control. Soup simmered all day, partly to soften the wild venison and partly to generate at least 6 feet of savoury heat radius. Baking bread meant warming the whole room and filling it with that toasty, yeasty scent that still holds the power to lull modern hearts into a nap. But warmth wasn't always physical. There was a kind of warmth in ritual, in shared cups of broth, in stories exchanged in low voices just before sleep. Someone might read, aloud if they could, or repeat a tale told 100 times, the words worn smooth as river stones. Laughter, murmurs, and the gentle clatter of needles knitting through wool mingled together like the very first white noise machine. So they layered. In clothing, in bedding, in affection. They leaned into one another, into routine, into the gentle insistence that winters would end and thaw would come. And until it did, they used every tool available: quilts, fire, folklore, and the simple human talent of finding warmth anywhere hearts are close. Tomorrow, perhaps, we'll drift gently into the world of food. Less about warmth and more about what counted as dinner, when growing your own groceries meant sometimes simply hoping they weren't looking back at you. By the time winter settled its weighty cloak across the frontier, every creaky board and rough-hewn beam became a participant in the family's battle against the cold. A cabin was no mere shelter. It was a negotiator between man and frost, an awkward marriage counselor between frozen socks and stubborn wood stoves. Inside, warmth was not so much achieved as it was wrestled from nature with every log dragged in, every crack stuffed with moss or, when artistic flair struck, clay packed with straw and old regrets. Insulation in the 1800s was a concept best understood as whatever you managed to jam in the walls before winter arrived. This might include sheep's wool, old newspapers if you were lucky, and if you were truly desperate, the family Bible, though this did raise theological questions best left to spring. The fireplace was the undisputed monarch of warmth, though its reign was capricious at best. It heated the room, certainly, the portion of the room sitting directly in front of it. The rest of the cabin lingered somewhere between meat locker and abandoned ice cellar, depending on the wind. But still, people gathered around it, as if it were a benevolent stove and spirit god. They cooked on it, dried socks around it, and stared into its flames while imagining warmer times, such as August. To stretch its powers, pioneers mastered the delicate art of heat redistribution. Blankets were not just covers, but strategic weapons, thick, hand-stitched, and sometimes woolen enough to constitute a separate clothing dimension. Heating the bed, as it were, often meant throwing in a brick from the fire, wrapped in flannel, one hoped, or using a warming pan filled with embers. Yes, embers. Fire was not only your best friend, it was the mildly dangerous sort of friend you had to handle with tongs. During especially brutal nights, families would resort to communal sleeping. not so much family bonding time, as everyone piled together like a sack of potatoes on top of Grandpa. Children, sleeping head to foot like awkward spoons, were stuffed like soft luggage into corners to avoid drafts that somehow snuck through seemingly solid walls, and parents often took turns restoking the fire at ungodly hours, muttering about raccoons and poorly cut chimney angles. Despite the effort, mornings were frequently marked by the crunch of frost inside the house. Water basins froze overnight. Beard icicles formed if someone dared a midnight breath, and boots, if left near the door, transformed into rigid artifacts that looked more suited to archaeological digs than farming. But with hardship came ingenuity. There were, for instance, makeshift window coverings, greased paper being a homespun favorite. It let a little bit of light in, and a lot more cold than anyone wanted, but at least it gave you something to glare at in the mornings. Some frontier families pasted old flour sacks over gaps in the walls and floorboards. Others adopted a more spiritual tilt, hoping that sheer force of will could stop a draft. Spoiler, it could not. Clever housewives, who might rightly be considered HVAC pioneers from another era, revived the stone heating trick. A rock, toasted diligently beside the hearth, could be transferred to the foot of a bed, a child's lap, or even inside boots to get the leather pliable enough for another frigid trudge to the barn. Interestingly, not all heat came from wood. Human and animal body heat played a major role in warming the home. In very dire conditions, settlers might bring livestock inside the house, which added some valuable degrees of warmth and approximately 10 lbs of aroma. One could argue that sharing a bedroom with a goat did wonders for character, but little for sleep hygiene. Despite the discomforts, or perhaps because of them, winter on the frontier built its own strange coziness. Families learned efficiency, they learned patience, and above all, they internalized a profound, almost spiritual appreciation for a pile of warm ashes and a well-placed blanket. And just as the fire wouldn't burn without tending, neither would the skills to survive a winter fade into sleep without careful passing from hand to hand, usually over steaming cups of something vaguely warm, and frequently with a slightly scorched biscuit in the other. Now, as the embers in our story glow gently at the edges of thought, there's still a whisper of warmth to follow. Just ahead, where supper simmers and traditions simmer even longer. Let's wander there, shall we? On a wind-whipped prairie evening, when the sun finally gave up and the stars blinked out shyly behind gauzy winter clouds, the heart of the frontier home wasn't in the parlor, or even the scratchy horsehair sofa no one truly enjoyed. It was in the kitchen stove, where warmth and dinner fought for supremacy on a single, sooty iron surface. Now, it's important to understand that frontier stoves were not glamorous. They weren't cast in decorative scrollwork or equipped with self-cleaning anything. No, these were steadfast appliances with personalities. They groaned when overburdened with wood, clanged mysteriously around midnight, and required a full-time emotional investment just to keep the fire lit. The stove was more than a cooking tool. It was a life partner. You couldn't simply turn it on. You had to coax it, stack the kindling just right, nurse it with patience, maybe whisper flattery to the damper if things were going badly. Children on the frontier could identify a good fire starter by the rhythm of their kindling chop. A loud, erratic hack meant things would probably be burned or raw. But a smooth, confident thwack, well, that was the kindling serenade of a successful stew day. The stew itself, naturally, was a democratic affair. Frontier families didn't cook according to craving. They cooked according to survival and what hadn't been nibbled by mice. A pot of dinner often started with salt pork, the delightfully salty cousin of modern bacon, aged in barrels and optimistic intentions. Add a floating onion, maybe even a carrot if it hadn't frozen into an edible icicle, and you had supper. In the colder months, root cellars were both a saving grace and a chilly gamble. They preserved apples, potatoes, and slightly instructive smells. If you ever craved introspection and the faint scent of buried cabbage, a root cellar was your cathedral. To fetch a turnip was to embark on a monk-like pilgrimage into the earthy undercroft of your own home. Of course, eating was more than just chewing. It was an event. Utensils weren't always carved with elegance, and sometimes a spoon doubled as a shovel for both soup and snow. Forks had a tendency to go missing, often last seen pretending to be miniature pitchforks in the sandbox of the yard. Most families shared large, beautifully plain wooden tables that bore scars of carved initials, hot iron pots, and childhood tantrums performed with a dramatic flair only a 3-year-old wielding stale cornbread can deliver. One could trace the family's history on those tabletops. The scratch that marked the year of the locusts, the mysterious burn no one claimed, and the small dent suspiciously resembling a forehead. Conversation during meals was hearty and often punctuated by the chomping of biscuits, whose density could legally qualify them as building material. Children contributed with tales of heroic chores and the occasional exaggerated bear encounter. He was 6 feet tall, Ma, and smelled like Grandpa on bath day. And when dinner was done, and the pot scraped clean with a crust of bread, the universal sponge of the 1800s, it was time to let the stove earn its keep as heater. Here, we must pause and offer due respect to the brave individuals, nearly always the smallest child or the parent with the shortest temper, tasked with feeding the stove during the long, itchy hours between midnight and dawn. This job involved stumbling from bed, bleary-eyed and foot-frozen, to shove hunks of wood into a metal maw in exchange for the continued privilege of not freezing solid. In the worst of winter, some families even kept a small pail, delicately called a comfort pot, by the stove for emergencies. The less said about that, the better. Let's just say it spared you a trip to the frosted outhouse at 3 a.m. Despite the hardships, there was a strange loveliness to it all. The way everyone leaned in unconsciously toward the fire, like flowers to the sun. The comforting din of wood crackle and crickets replaced by snowflakes tapping in Morse code on window panes. The surprising joy of crisp cornbread and warm molasses, eaten while steam from one's breath curled like pipe smoke in the lamplight. And once the embers tucked beneath ash and the last biscuit crumb was devoured, the frontier kitchen slept too, silent, heavy with the smell of wood smoke and onion, and awaiting the next day's dance with fire, frost, and the eternal hunt for clean spoons. Will soon step softly into the bedroom again, where cold walls, shared quilts, and a symphony of sleeping noses continued the quiet choreography of prairie life. The wind tapped gently at the sod-covered roof, like a polite ghost reminding folks that winter on the frontier arrived without asking permission. Beneath that roof, the family sat huddled in what could most generously be called the common space, a room that wore many hats and one pair of socks, usually drying near the stove. Here, families didn't just sleep and eat, they survived, and they did so wrapped in quilts, laughter, and the occasional strategic use of livestock body heat. Let us now consider one essential tool in the frontier family's battle against the great indoors, the cast iron stove. Known for emitting enough heat to melt your soup and your eyebrows, these stoves were the heart of the home, sometimes quite literally, as everyone seemed magnetically pulled toward the blessed warmth. In the early mornings, it was a game of bravery to be the first out from under the homemade quilts, woven with scraps of old dresses and optimism. There was always one person, often the youngest child, for some reason involving birth order logic that's been lost to time, nudged awake and nudged again, until they stumbled toward the stove to rekindle the dying embers from last night. This was the rite of passage, to graduate from sleeper to fire starter before breakfast. And when the fire roared, the household breathed better, not just because defrosting one's nose improved morale, but because it signaled the beginning of another day where your chief goals were simply to stay warm and keep from eating your future seed corn. Meals were humble but tactical ventures. Beans were frequent guests at the table, reliable companions that returned again and again, each time slightly more. Fermented. Cornbread, when there was cornmeal, served as both utensil and social lubricant. Broth might be made from a chicken that had, until yesterday, lived rent-free in the corner of the cabin, occasionally laying eggs and always judging the humans with one impressive eye. But don't think it was all hardship and rough-hewn stoicism. Evenings brought their own rituals of comfort. After supper, the term dinner being a luxury word for people with servants, they'd gather near the fire. Parents told stories, not always true, but factual enough to entertain. Children sewed with nimble fingers, squinting in dim candlelight, while someone inevitably whittled something unidentifiable but greatly satisfying. It was also the hour of the corn husk mattress, which was remarkably a competitive improvement over bare floorboards. Soft they were not, but they were filled with possibilities, chiefly that you might not freeze to death if you buried yourself deep enough in the husks and quilt layers. Some families even added warm stones to the bed, wrapped in cloth. And some truly avant-garde folks tucked in heated turnips, whose dual identity as vegetable and bedding accessory deserves more respect than it gets. Privacy, on the frontier, was as rare as tea from China. One-room cabins often meant that your bedtime lullaby might include your father's snore, your mother's snore, your baby sister's plaintive squeak, and the thud of wind rattling the shutters like a nervous banjo. Romance survived in murmurs and hopeful looks exchanged over drying socks. And births, they happened in the same room where beans were cooked and boots were scraped, all under the solemn gaze of a picture frame that only contained wallpaper because it was cheaper than a photograph. Still, there was a kind of intimacy to it, a woven closeness born of shared discomfort, homemade comforters, and the knowledge that everyone's socks smelled the same by February. And those cold, fiery winters bred a resilience that no quilt alone could offer. The frontier family understood, unconsciously perhaps, that warmth wasn't just a matter of temperature. It was found in shared stories, in singing off-key hymns, in the press of bodies beneath fading patchworks. Together, they built lives that crackled like firewood in the stove, lively, fleeting, and beautifully ordinary. As the snow piled quietly against the log walls, the family would drift, one by one, into sleep, the room growing quieter except for the soft wheeze of the wind and the shifting of bedfellows adjusting their elbow from someone's rib. And somewhere outside, past the frost-rimmed glass, was not just the wilderness, but tomorrow. The kindling of another day waits just beyond the embers, and on that tomorrow, they tackle a problem older than history itself. What to do when the cow escapes during a snowstorm and seeks indoor accommodations. But that's a story warming gently on the horizon. As the sun bowed out behind a curtain of snow-covered hills and the frontier settled into its nightly hush, it was time for the smallest things to take center stage. Not battles nor bear attacks, but the gentle rituals that shape the hidden hours of a homestead. Chief among them, the mysterious and sacred art of keeping one's toes warm. Now, warmth on the frontier was not so much a commodity as a competitive sport. And while wood stoves and fireplaces may seem like the obvious solution, they had their own fine print. Wood had to be chopped by hand, of course, preferably by someone whose knuckles had long ago stopped fearing frostbite. You could almost hear the rhythm of axe against log echoing in the tree line like the frontier's heartbeat. But warmth wasn't just about tools and timber. Oh no, it was a family project, choreographed with as much care as a local barn dance. First, there were the windows. Drafts didn't need a written invitation. Any crack not in the wood or mischievous breeze could slip in and snake around ankles. So, windows were stuffed. Really stuffed. With anything on hand, old rags, animal fur, even bits of newspaper, appreciated more for their insulating properties than their editorial excellence. One 1870s farmer in Missouri noted that he only read half the articles before cramming them into a sill with his mittens still on. And then there were the people. Every body was an opportunity to generate heat. Family members slept huddled like spoons in a kitchen drawer, whether they liked one another or not. Children usually slept together, usually crosswise across a bed packed with straw, because sleeping lengthwise was a bourgeois luxury reserved for parents and the family cat. If a small cousin accidentally kicked the family dog in her sleep, that was simply called circulating body heat. But in truth, no single invention revolutionized frontier warmth so thoroughly as, wait for it, the bed warmer. Picture it, if you would. A metal pan with a long wooden handle, filled with hot coals and slipped between the bed sheets like a Trojan horse of toasty intentions. It would warm the bed from the inside out, but not too long, of course, or your straw mattress would become a smouldering memory and the entire family would have to sleep in the barn, which wouldn't be much of an improvement. Just ask the cows. Still, some pioneers skipped the coals and heated stones instead, placing them near the hearth before bed, then nestling them like friendly turtles at the foot of the bed. Accounts vary on how many toes were saved versus accidentally scorched, but we like to believe the rocks were mostly heroes. All these methods were noble, certainly, but no discussion of frontier warmth is complete without tipping the stovepipe hat to the long underwear. Known in polite company as union suits, these were one-piece woolen marvels that both resisted the cold and made everyone resemble Victorian toddlers. They had the added charm of a rear flap, popularly known as the trapdoor, which allowed for necessary visits to the privy without a complete wardrobe reversal. Of course, on especially frigid nights, not even the bravest soul ventured out to the outhouse unless absolutely compelled by nature, and sometimes even then, the odds were weighed. Toileting negotiations were intense in January. Now, let's not forget the communal phenomenon of the family quilt. These were rarely merely decorative. Each fold whispered of practicality, worn-out shirts, bits of cloth from an old Sunday dress, the remains of an apron too stained to save. It was not just a blanket, it was textile autobiography. And there they lay, all together under their patchwork memoir, in a house that creaked like it was reminiscing. And the final trick, the secret known to every cold weather settler, worth their salt pork. Don't sleep alone. Even if you weren't blessed with a bustling household, you might keep a warm brick or, in some cases, a fat barn cat near your chest to keep the chill at bay. There is more than one diary entry that earnestly thanks Whiskers for preventing frost nose. Huddled together under layers of wool, fur, and stories, they met the winter not as adversaries, but as companions. Every breath exhaled into the dark cabin air was a quiet, foggy hymn to survival. And tomorrow would come again, with its wood to chop, stoves to light, and socks to defrost. But for now, the house was still. The fire had gone to glowing embers, and inside the thick silence of the walls, something else stirred, something about breakfast. But that's a tale best told when the pot is on and the biscuits begin to rise. Of all the forgotten arts lost to the march of time, latrine digging techniques, bonnet starching customs, the nuanced etiquette of borrowing a neighbour's butter churn, perhaps none is more underappreciated than the frontier family's sacred lunchtime ritual. Not the boisterous midday affair you might imagine with clanging plates and uproarious laughter, but a hushed and reverent exercise in coordinated chewing. Eating on the frontier was equal parts survival and spiritual choreography. Now, before you picture gingham cloths and dainty pies perched on porches painted by golden prairie light, let us recalibrate. Frontier lunch was quite often cold corn mush scraped lovingly from a wooden pail. And lovingly here means desperately. Grain, after all, kept longer than sentiment. A typical midday meal, or dinner, as our pioneer predecessors confusingly called it, might consist of what remained from breakfast: cornbread mottled with soot, a sliver of salted pork, or for the truly fortunate, yesterday's beans that had developed their own quiet complexity overnight. Each dish was a love letter written in bacon grease and scorched hope. Now, the setting of this culinary display was the family table, which in many cabins doubled as a place for sewing, teaching letters, candle making, leather stitching, funeral planning, and every so often giving birth. Still, at noon, the family would gather there, stomachs rumbling and cheeks wind-chapped, fringed by damp mittens and disapproving chickens. Children were expected to be silent unless choking, in which case they were permitted one unified cough. Fathers chewed slowly, both for digestion and to allow time for thought. Usually thoughts like, will we have firewood next week? Or, was that squirrel edible or vengeful? Mothers doled out portions with a discerning eye, each ladleful part science, part benevolent tyranny. Everyone had their preference. Some guarded their salt pork like it was state currency, setting it aside for the end of the meal, as though saving it might impress the neighbours, should any arrive. Younger kids often pressed their cornbread into fanciful shapes before devouring them. It was one of the few allowable outlets for creativity, the other being inventing new ways to complain about milking. On particularly frigid days, which is to say most days between October and May, people dined with coats still on, breath misting above the tin bowls. The heat from the small hearth fire fought valiantly to warm the room, but usually lost to the draughts sneaking through every splendidly hand-hewn crack in the cabin wall. Eating quickly was encouraged not out of efficiency, but in a race against the food refreezing on your spoon. The frontier spoon itself deserves quiet reverence. Often passed down between generations like a talisman, it was a multifunctional artifact, a scooping tool, a cooking instrument, sometimes a comb, a snow gauge, or, in moments of bravery during sibling squabbles, a tiny, ineffective sword. And yet, Despite the humble meal and the cold and the ever-looming threat of root-cellar mold, there was a certain comfort to it all, an unspoken rhythm. The way the baby slapped dough on the floorboards, the grandfather who told the same story about being chased by an ox with vengeance in its eyes, despite no one being entirely sure oxen could feel vengeance, or indeed distinguish family members. These moments were stitched into the family's fabric as tightly as the clothes they wore day and night. When guests appeared, which they occasionally did, having followed chimney smoke like tired moths, the rules shifted. The table grew louder. Fancy items were summoned, molasses, or perhaps a boiled potato that hadn't gone entirely cynical. Children were required to use table manners, which meant slightly fewer elbows in the gravy. After all, one never knew when a travelling preacher or a lonely fur trader might decide to offer news from 6 towns over, or even better, a sack of flour in exchange for soup and gossip. But more often, it was just them, the family, eating together in a cabin smiling against the snow, united by necessity, affection, and rough-cut wooden chairs designed for posture and penance. Meals were brief, often silent, but imbued with a quiet dignity. It wasn't just food, it was communion with the land, fought for with calloused hands and frozen feet. A salted chunk of domestic triumph. And as lunch concluded, bowls were stacked, spoons gathered, and the hearth poked back to life. Life resumed, chores to do, traps to check, maybe even a stolen nap if no one was looking. But for those few precious frostbitten minutes each day, the family breathed together, warmed by food and something even more elusive, each other, which invites us now into the hush of the frontier afternoon, when the warmth fades and winter's long sigh resurfaces. In the howling winter of the American frontier, life slowed into a soft hush under blankets of snow and the heavy creak of frozen cabin timbers. With the sun bedding down by mid-afternoon, the long evenings were not marked by flickering televisions or scrolling thumbs, but rather by something harder to come by and even harder to keep. Warmth. You might imagine a roaring fireplace, pioneers reclining nearby with mugs of root coffee, perhaps even someone playing the fiddle with impromptu toe-tapping merriment. That's all quite sweet, utter nonsense most nights, but sweet. The truth was, staying warm on the frontier was less about cozy ambience and more about sheer survival, ingenuity, and, let's be honest, a lot of huddling. In your average one-room cabin, insulation was a theory, not a feature. Walls might be sealed with mud daub or moss, but winter winds were determined little beasts. They'd slip through any crack, sneaking in to nip your nose just as you were drifting off. So pioneers turned to body heat. Yes, the original home heating system. At night, entire families bundled together under a wild melange of quilts, furs, and whatever they weren't wearing. Children often shared a bed, or even slept lined up like cordwood on sheepskins, side by side, the little ones tucked in the middle for safety and thermal efficiency. Basically, the frontier version of a heated mattress pad, but louder and occasionally covered in porridge. Furs were prized not just for their insulating properties, but because animals were, inconveniently, already built to survive the cold. Even after their wild days had ended, beaver pelts or buffalo robes made splendid covers. And if you were particularly fortunate or slightly eccentric, you'd have a feather bed, a miraculous Victorian invention which did not include any feathers poking through into your lumbar region, at least not at first. For heat, a hearth was king, and the fire within it a living thing, temperamental and needy. Wood had to be gathered and chopped in copious amounts before the snow came, stacked carefully to dry. A miscalculation could mean running out towards spring, and more than one unfortunate soul tried to burn frozen logs out of desperation, only to be rewarded with more smoke in their lungs than heat in their boots. Families kept the fire going well into the night. This task often fell to older children, particularly teens who, being teenagers, were usually awake worrying about things like petticoats, church socials, or whether anyone in town had noticed their new hat. So why not give them a stick and tell them to prod the logs at 4 a.m.? But perhaps the finest example of frontier warmth came not from firewood or furs, but from something called the foot warmer, a device guaranteed to be scalding hot in entirely the wrong spots. Picture a small metal box or ceramic brick filled with heated coals, placed inside a wooden frame and wrapped in fabric or tucked in at the bottom of the bed. Ingenious, yes, but perhaps not altogether restful. There's something unsettling about sleeping near a device that is both a cherished comfort and a mild burn hazard. Of course, folks sometimes got creative. Heated stones from the hearth could be wrapped in towels and placed under blankets, cozy until they weren't. One might find themselves cuddled up with a warm cabbage, if that's all the pantry offered that night. And truly desperate souls would even resort to spooning the family dog, not as a sign of affection, but contract negotiation. You provide warmth, I allow you to sleep on the quilt. Often, it wasn't just heat that kept the family warm, but rhythm, a kind of seasonal dance of survival. The days were spent laboring, the evenings huddled close, and the nights bundled together in human burrito configurations that modern sleep therapists might strongly advise against. Yet, there was comfort in that stubborn persistence, in that ridiculous layering of wool and wit, of practicality and patched-up quilts passed down like heirlooms. As snow whispered against the log walls and the fire settled into its dreamy glow, the family curled tighter together, united by necessity and with any luck, love. Nearby, a kettle offered a soft hiss. Warm water, medicine for cold toes and colder soup. It may not have been luxurious, but it was life. And in its own down-stuffed way, it was beautiful. Now, as dawn begins its patient journey below the horizon, and another log is stirred in the hearth, let's wander a little further into those sleepy cabins. The tools may seem crude, but what of the food? Next, we cradle our curiosity over frontier fare, the edible wonders and occasional horrors that sustain generations through frost and famine. There are few things more humbling than the winter wind scraping across a prairie cabin, especially one built from sod, with ambition far sturdier than its walls. It wasn't that frontier families lacked cleverness. Rather, they were conducting a very slow, sometimes drafty experiment in how not to freeze to death while still managing to raise chickens, children, and occasionally a fiddle-playing uncle who forgot he was supposed to chop wood. At the center of this noble survival effort was the hearth. More than a fireplace, really. It was the soul of the home, the snack drawer of the 1800s, a place for warmth, storytelling, cornmeal mush, and minor burns. The hearth gave light in the dark, warmth in the cold, and a constant excuse not to go outside and fix the fence just yet. But of course, not every dwelling was blessed with such a luxury. Out on the plains, where trees were about as common as moonlight on a cloudy night, folks got creative. They burned whatever they could: dried buffalo chips, corn stalks, twisted hay bundles, and in one very unfortunate experiment, the family's copy of Dante's Inferno, which proved fitting and ironic. Inside these homes, Families layered up like human onions, wool, flannel, blankets made from patchwork memories, and whatever else could be draped, tied, or repurposed. Underwear became overwear. Nightcaps evolved into full facial garments. And children, like puppies, were often encouraged to sleep in heaps for optimal thermal efficiency. It wasn't so much cuddling as community-generated warmth, an adorable kind of logistics. Mothers became master strategists of heat management. Potatoes cooked at supper were not simply food. They were bedtime foot warmers, tucked lovingly into fabric and placed at the bottom of the bed. Later, as the potato cooled into a small, tragic meteor, it could be eaten as a chilly midnight snack, assuming the family dog hadn't gotten to it first. To be clear, these homes weren't all gloom and frostbite. Wintertime was also when stories were told, socks were darned, and songs were sung badly by enthusiastic relatives. Quilting became a group affair, and if your stitchwork resembled something a squirrel might leave behind while escaping a thimble trap, well, that was just part of your charm. Children learned riddles. Grandparents pretended not to sleep in the rocking chair by the coals, and fathers held long debates with the stove about why it wasn't working properly. At night, the room would slowly fill with a gentle hush. The fire, down to its embers, glowed like a sleepy eye half-lidded with dreams. A few crackles, a kettle cooling, and the distant sound of the wind wrestling with the shack's modest chimney. These were the lullabies of the long frontier nights. Beds were shared not just out of affection, but out of sheer necessity. Siblings slept side by side, often top to tail, which sounds charming, until you imagine waking up under 6 feet of someone else's wool stocking. Parents kept their younger children close, but not too close, lest someone leak warmth or misfire a chamber pot maneuver. Frontier nights had rules after all. Then there were homemade bed warmers, metal pans filled with coals, slid gingerly under the covers long before anyone dared climb in. Misplaced, they could set your quilt on fire. Properly placed, they were little miracles in a tin. Improvised versions included brick-wrapped-in-rag systems, or in rare acts of desperation, a goat who'd been bribed with oats and a warm scarf. Of course, none of this would matter if the roof gave out. So winter prep involved sealing every crack with moss, burlap, or in-laws, unsolicited advice. Windows got stuffed, doors packed with straw snakes, and if icy winds still squeaked through, well, you just added another blanket, or two, or cat. It wasn't ideal, but people got by, with grit, wit, and a roasted potato in their socks. And as the wind slowed and the cabin dimmed to soft shadows, the gentle silence hinted there was yet more to explore by firelight's flicker. Perhaps where warmth wasn't just a matter of fuel, but of what and who you kept close. Out on the chilled frontier, in places where the wind brushed the skin like a stern aunt reminding you to stand up straighter, warmth wasn't just a comfort. It was an ongoing life or death negotiation. And while the settler families became masters of the flannel and firewood arts, there was another kind of warmth, one both practical and deeply communal, that glowed just as brightly: shared labor. Yes, frontier folk had a deep, almost romantic relationship with chores. You see, when your roof was made of sod and your floors were often indistinguishable from the surrounding field, except for the occasional rug beetle infestation, housework wasn't about aesthetics. It was a form of survival theatre. The kitchen doubled as the laundry, bedroom, birthing chamber, and incidentally, the jail for any misbehaving chicken who'd wandered in. Morning light found frontier families stretching creaky limbs from straw-stuffed mattresses or corn husk ticking. The sort of bedding that taught you to sleep very still if you wanted to avoid being slowly exfoliated by breakfast. And then, the whole household sprang, or more accurately, shuffled into action. Youngsters were assigned the most urgent of dawn tasks, fetching water. It sounds simple until you account for frozen pumps, distant streams, and the occasional need to defend your bucket from a particularly bold goose. Goose chasing was not classified under cardio in modern terms, but it certainly worked the legs, the lungs, and the ability to think quickly under waddling pressure. With the hearth lit, provided the matches hadn't been hoarded by Grandpa for his pipe, mothers often took command of the breakfast brigade. This involved juggling a cast iron skillet, the weight of a small cannonball, stirring cornmeal with one hand, while the other swatted away a curious toddler trying to taste test raw biscuit dough. Fathers, typically up by candlelight or even chimney glow, busied themselves with the outdoor rituals. Wood splitting wasn't just about keeping the fire going. No, it was about proving your enduring physical relevance to the family, because if you couldn't split a log, you might get reassigned to whittling spoons, or even worse, oral storytelling duty with Great Aunt Tilda, whose tangents had tangents. Everyone had jobs, and everyone's jobs involved some degree of frozen fingers, ash-stained sleeves, or a regrettable encounter with a stubborn ox. Even the smallest children might be tasked with egg collection, an angelic chore, until it involved navigating a coop barricaded by a psychotically puffed-up hen named Henrietta, who presumably guarded those eggs like they were royal heirs. But here's the secret few modern folks remember. These chores did more than fill bellies or warm cabins. They stitched together a rhythm, a choreography of survival that taught every member of the household they were necessary, even if your job was just to churn butter while humming an off-key lullaby. You were adding to the warmth of the home. Winter chores offered their own icy enchantments, snow shoveling, roof knocking, essentially whacking icicles off eaves and hoping they didn't impale you, and the delicate science of keeping livestock alive during blizzards. Frontier pigs, by the way, may or may not have been routinely tucked in with old quilts. I'm not saying there were nightcaps involved, but I'm not saying it either. At night, the same hands that dug root cellars and churned cream would settle into mending. Socks were patched, shirts were rebuttoned, and the art of darning became less quaint hobby and more military-grade textile triage. Evenings were hushed, lit by tallow candles or kerosene lamps, whose smell permanently etched itself into bedding. The fire would dim, children would yawn, and over in the corner, the family cat, who'd contributed nothing to the day's labor except dramatic stretches in sunbeams, would finally deign to curl up with the humans it tolerated. Shared labor on the frontier wasn't glamorous, but it had poetry. The poetry of 1,000 simple acts strung together with grit, soot, and the occasional cuss word muttered at a frozen wagon axle. It was a quiet warmth, a sense that no one faced the biting wind alone. Some might argue it was exhausting, and yes, it was. But it was also comforting in the way that only repetitive, necessary work can be. The kind of work that empties the mind and fills the home. The kind that sends you to sleep not just tired, but deeply, thoroughly useful. And speaking of settling in after a long day's work, next, we'll slip inside the peculiar world of nighttime conversation on the frontier. The whispery tales, potentially haunted fiddle songs, and bedtime stories delivered by kerosene light and wildly unreliable memory. By late autumn on the frontier, when the wind had that certain whistle through the rafters, a kind of nasal complaint only a pioneer wind could perfect, families began performing a quiet kind of magic. They didn't call it that, of course. They called it getting ready for winter, or, with ominous brevity, battening down. But to survive in a one-room log cabin tucked into the wilderness, where firewood smoked more than it warmed and socks were best described as aspirational, required more than preparation. It required ingenuity, cooperation, and quite often close-quarter huddling. First came the stuffing, not the turkey kind, but the kind that involved every available crack, crevice, and morally suspicious draft in the log walls. Widow Jenkins down the road swore by moss and dried mud. Caulking, she called it. As if her little cabin was some sort of crooked schooner sailing through a sea of frost. Others preferred rags, newspaper, or anything they could shove between chinks. One particularly inventive settler used the pages of an unwanted almanac for insulation and dubbed it papery revenge. January, we're told, was unusually well padded. Next came the transformation of the home itself. The table, usually the site of meals, mending and sibling arguments over who took the last cornbread heel, was nudged toward the hearth. Chairs once scattered haphazardly throughout the room were corralled into a tight semicircle close to the fire, along with stools, boxes, and anything else one could reasonably sit on or perch upon if you were a cat or an adventurous toddler. The frontier version of open floor plan heating. Gather close, bring your own warmth. But perhaps the most impressive winter adaptation was the beds. Or rather, the bed. Singular, because where once private straw ticks lay modestly along the floor, by December they'd somehow merged into one sprawling, rustling organism. The family bed. Picture it. A pile of sleeping humans, layered and nestled like nesting dolls made of wool and flannel. Parents pressed to one side, youngest children wedged in like socks in a too small drawer, and sometimes even a visiting cousin or aging aunt wedged between for added insulation. Dogs too, if they were small. Cats, if they consented. The goal was less comfort and more collective body heat. Love, technically, had little to do with it, but many a family did say that winter taught them to love each other, or at least tolerate each other's feet. For warmth beyond body heat, frontier folks relied, of course, on their stalwart fireplaces. These were not the cheerfully crackling affairs of Christmas cards, but great soot-stained beasts that roared grudgingly if fed right, and spat smoke rebelliously if fed wrong. Firewood became currency, loyalty, and leisure activity all rolled into one. Each log chopped was measured not in effort, but in hours of future warmth. A good stack of seasoned oak could rate higher than gold to a frostbitten settler. And if you were lucky enough to be on dish duty that night, you just might time it so you washed your tin plate very slowly and suspiciously close to the hearth. There were, too, the odd contraptions of warmth, bed warmers filled with embers, hot bricks wrapped in cloth and tucked at the foot of the bed, and for the dangerously optimistic, a system known as "let's try sleeping in our clothes." Wool long johns were the de facto uniform from November through March, only ever removed for brief breath-held washing rituals involving snowmelt and regret. Meals during those cold weeks kept mostly to the theme of substance over flair, with stews of potatoes, dried beans, and preserved meats bubbling long and low, more science than supper. Leftovers were not a problem. Everything reheated naturally, just by placing it next to the fire, or, in a pinch, beneath a particularly warm dog. Evenings stretched long and slow in winter. By firelight, people read aloud from books whose pages had curled and browned with age or told stories passed down from grandfathers who may or may not have existed. Children were shushed gently with lullabies and old-timey threats like sleep or the frost witch'll find you. They often slept just to avoid further explanation, with the wind huffing at the door like some disappointed ghost, and the stars twinkling through windows rhymed with dreamy frost. Families swaddled in quilts, and each other waited out the winter night. And in this snug hush of wool and wood smoke, the frontier was, for just a few hours, less wild. In the pale blue hush of early morning, a new challenge awaited, the frozen chamber pot. But for now, let's stay wrapped in the warmth of coals and quiet company. And somewhere beyond the curtain of snow-dusted dreams, another frontier comfort begins to simmer, a hot drink and the curious warmth of something stronger. As the wind whispered across the prairie and nudged frosted tufts of grass into little curtsies, frontier families found themselves attending to one of the most underestimated ballets of survival: layering. A performance not on any stage, but reconstructed daily in sod homes, log cabins, and the occasional gloriously drafty barn. Layering clothing for warmth wasn't simply fashion. It was a matter of not waking up with a layer of frost decorating your eyebrows, like nature's own confused attempt at festive makeup. A typical frontier winter ensemble began with the underlayer: long johns, often made of itchy wool, or, if you were very lucky and somewhat less concerned about smell, a well-worn cotton. These thermal anklets of stubborn hope were pulled on before the fire had even agreed to get out of bed. Darning holes in these undergarments was a near-constant chore, as fabric wore through faster than patience during a February blizzard. Over this first layer came shirts, vests, and trousers. You didn't own many of these. 3 was positively luxurious. 1 to wear, 1 to mend, and 1 to deny you were currently wearing. Vests were especially beloved. They gave the illusion of fanciness, cloaked your midsection like a woolen handshake from Aunt Mildred, and had the ever-valuable feature of extra pockets, perfect for carrying nails, jerky, or occasionally half a biscuit intended for someone else. And then came coats. Oh, the coat, that noble piece of outerwear, often so thick it gave the wearer the silhouette of a determined squash, was the final defense against biting winds that howled louder than a coyote choir on espresso. It wasn't uncommon to see coats patched together from 3 different generations of regret: Dad's sleeves, Grandpa's lining, a collar stolen from a buffalo that had looked chilly itself. For the feet, anything that could be called a boot was treated like royalty. If your boots didn't let in snow until the 2nd mile to the barn, you had yourself a miracle akin to a modern waterproof phone. Frontier people stuffed newspapers, straw, or even spare socks into their boots, not always to warm their feet, but to dissuade the boots from harboring mice. A practical concern, as warm places invited furry friendships. But it wasn't just the people who layered up. The homes themselves were swaddled in every warmth-giving trick known or invented by necessity's sudden burst of genius. Cracks in log walls were stuffed with mud and moss, sometimes even old cloth or newspaper headlines promising spring that never arrived on time. Rag rugs were laid thick across floors, not purely for aesthetics, but to discourage feet from learning what frozen toes truly felt like. Family beds were their own category of warmth engineering. Blankets were stacked like lasagna. Quilt, wool, quilt again. An extra coat might be thrown on top. Then a dog. Then a second dog. Then a sleepy toddler who'd wandered over after losing a midnight battle with their own cold pillow. Waking up meant extracting oneself from this sleepy tower with the delicacy of a magician's assistant in reverse. By necessity, everything became a heat trap or heat donor. Iron pots filled with hot coals were wrapped in towels and set in beds like snoozy dragons. Bricks were baked near the fire and slipped under feet or into pockets, turning mundane rocks into cherished artifacts of temporary joy. In some homes, even the family Bible was used to press flattened rags into usable panels of quilt padding. As Ma might whisper with a wink, the good book keeps you warm in more ways than one. Even meals leaned warm. Porridges, stews, baked root vegetables still clinging to the earth's heat. These weren't just food, they were edible insulation. There is something calming about watching steam rise from a wooden spoon, fogging cracked glass windows and noses in equal delight. And through it all, there was the sound of crackling, the stove, the fire, the floor complaining as boots dried too close to the heat, music in its own dry, contented tongue. Outside, snow fell like softened punctuation. Inside, bodies curled beneath layers of wool, flannel, and kinship. Sharing a bed with 3 siblings and a cousin might not be every child's dream, but in winter, the idea of personal space gave way to the far superior concept of shared temperature. And when all was still, and frost crept gently over the insides of windows like a bashful artist at work, families breathed out clouds that faded in the hush. Warm stories stitched together with time, flannel, and a few daring toes poking out from under quilts to test tomorrow's chill. And in the hush of that cozy, layered world, another need quietly stirred. How would they save enough daylight for all this living? But that is another warm thought for another gentle evening. Winter on the frontier had a way of flattening the world. When the wind howled across the plains like a cranky old violinist in a hurry to finish his solo, the great outdoors became more of a theory than a practical option. And so, families drew inward, huddled like puffed-up chickadees inside cabins that were warmer by contrast, rather than by any real measurement of comfort. Inside, the hearth ruled. It wasn't just the way to cook or heat water. It was the sun of the household solar system. Everything revolved around it. The trick was to stay close enough to absorb the heat, but far enough that your wool socks didn't smolder, and your eyebrows survived the encounter. Families employed a variety of strategies to retain precious warmth during the long winter nights. Some of these were practical, some were comically desperate, and most were both. Let's begin with the most loyal source of heat after the fire, one another. Sleeping arrangements in the cabin often followed what we might generously call the burrito principle. Everyone packed in as tight as a log pile in November. Children were strategically layered like geological strata, usually in bed together, sometimes dressed in so many nightclothes they resembled small wool-clad armadillos. The adults, meanwhile, shared not only the bed, but often heavy quilts that could double as fortifications in battle. If the family had a dog, it wasn't just a companion. It was a heating appliance with 4 legs and occasional snoring. Dogs typically earned their keep simply by being warm and willing to curl up at the foot, or in some cases, right in the middle of the bed. Cats, more selective in their affections, contributed to warmth using the selective toaster model, briefly warming a human sternum or thigh before vanishing back into the shadows. Blankets were another frontier obsession. Tales exist of families spending entire months sewing patchwork quilts, more complicated than most modern tax forms. Frontier quilting bees weren't just social occasions. They were strategic alliances in the war against frostbite. Each textile scrap had a history. Grandpa's worn-out trousers, last year's flour sack, or the mysterious swatch nobody remembered owning in the first place. Of course, not every night was spent in peaceful, bundled slumber. There were nocturnal adventures. Sometimes the fire died faster than expected, which triggered an emergency log on the embers operation. The unlucky soul assigned to this task would rise, shiver theatrically across the cold floorboards, trip over a stool, curse the dog, and finally jab the embers like they owed him money, before collapsing back into bed, forever changed. Then there were the bed warmers. Ingenious. Little metal pans filled with embers and slipped between the sheets before turning in. This all sounds wonderfully quaint, until you remember that placing burning coals in a wooden box on top of a straw mattress was a bit of a gamble. It was rather like inviting warmth in for the night, and hoping it didn't bring arson as a +1. Meals became heat sources by proxy. Breakfast, for instance, served dual purposes: to feed the belly and thaw out the face. Hot porridge, eggs cooked in a pan that never quite cooled, and thick slices of corn cake crisped along the edge of the fire, all delivered on steaming plates that were hugged like radiator panels before anyone took a bite. The kitchen, such as it was, doubled as a climate-controlled paradise. During cooking hours, you could almost pretend it was spring. Cupboards were lined with heavy paper to keep out drafts, and windows stuffed with rags to prevent the icy wind from whistling lullabies of despair. Even lanterns helped just a little. Their small, flickering flames added warmth in the physics sense, though more often they lit up faces and sparked conversation. People reminisced, joked, gossiped in whispers. Folktales flowed here, fueled by candle wax and creativity. Children would drift off mid-story, already tangled up in dreams of heroics and homesteading. And while the cold never really relented, it grew tolerable in the symmetry of routine. The fire, the quilts, the closeness. They stitched winter together. Because you see, warmth wasn't merely a temperature. It was the sound of shared laughter in a dark room, the creak of a rocking chair, the hush that settled after the last ember was tucked in like a glowing pet. And though outside the snow still fell with the steady rhythm of a sleeping breath, inside, frontier families faced the frost, one cup of stew and one toasty dog at a time. And just when the world felt all but frozen, another warmth waited just ahead. As twilight settled over the stretching plains and pine-shadowed hollows of the American frontier, the families of old began their nightly symphony with quiet rituals and creaking wood. Our sturdy pioneers may have survived wolves, blizzards, and midwife-led tooth extractions. But the true test of their pioneer grit came at bedtime, when 20 toes and 3 elbows tried to coexist under one wool-wrapped hay-stuffed mattress. By necessity, and often by budget, privacy was more suggestion than policy. Most families shared a single room, and thus a single source of warmth, the fire. That humble hearth-fed flame was not just a symbol of domestic coziness, it was life. The fire gave you heat, cooked your beans, and warned off the kind of strangers children would read about someday in penny dreadfuls. Before the days of central heating and the miracle of double glazing, pioneers slept near the stove like it owed them rent. This led to what affectionate historians might call the strategic family pile. Babies closest to the stove, lest their little toes resemble frozen corn muffins by morning. Parents or grandparents between baby and door, functioning simultaneously as protection and insulation. Then siblings, in order of patience, wedged side by side like mismatched silverware in a drawer. The dog, wherever it liked, likely in the best warm spot. Probably smug about it too. Clothing, you ask? Well, the answer is, whatever wasn't frozen. Many simply slept in what they wore all day, which could be everything they owned, layered like an onion. If onions lived lives of persistent draftiness, nightshirts became more common towards the later 1800s, often made of flannel or any remaining fabric not cut into quilt squares. And yes, there were quilts, bless them, made from flour sacks, old dresses, and anything that formerly functioned as curtains, linens, or a cousin's unfortunate prom outfit. Speaking of quilts, few objects were as beloved or over-engineered. They were not merely blankets. They were caloric containment devices. Layers and layers of stitched sentiment and practical survivalism. A well-made frontier quilt could trap more heat than a July barn dance, and perhaps more smells. They were rarely washed, because why risk freezing your bedding solid in the January wind when you could just air it out come spring? If you had enough coins in your pouch, or perhaps enough favor at the trading post, you might own a feather bed. These were luxurious, lumpy contraptions that resembled couches made of goose and hope. They sagged gloriously in the middle, folding their occupants into a shared, feathery democracy. No matter your dreams, you all fell to the center. Some called it romantic. Others called it a spinal realignment. Outside, the wind might howl melodramatic verses through the cracks in the logs. Snow skittered across the roof in a kind of slow-motion avalanche, while inside, the wood of the cabin creaked and moaned, sounding for all the world like it was adjusting its joints after a long chore day. And yet, families slept, huddled, tangled, occasionally elbowed, but warm under layers of quilted love and pragmatic design. They learned to listen to the rhythms of the frontier night and respond accordingly. A popping fire. All was well. Silence. Alarm bells. Too much silence meant the fire had gone out. Not just inconvenient, but dangerous. Someone, often the designated firekeeper of the night, tiptoed out from under the covers, stoked the ashes, sneezed once from the cold, and scrambled back into the human burrito. These unsung flame tenders kept the night alive and the frostbite at bay. Not everyone slept through the night, of course. Some dreamt with their eyes open, thinking of the next morning's chores. Others whispered beneath quilts stitched with generations of threadbare jokes and frontier gossip. Children asked questions into the dark. Will Mars sourdough rise this time? Or do cows dream? And someone, half asleep, would mumble an answer, beginning with, I reckon, whether they reckoned correctly or not. Dreams on the frontier came wrapped in flickering firelight, faint clattering shutters, and the slow breathing quiet of a household at rest. They wrapped the mind in stories unfinished of distant lands and warm biscuits, of feather beds and the ever-crumbling edge of adventure. And so, wrapped in time, warmth, and the sturdy fabric of memory, the night slipped over the frontier like a second quilt, heavier than expected, but exactly enough. Sleep, too, walks softly under sod roof and timber beam. Let it fold over you now. The fire is crackling low, the wind has hushed its tune, and the night, like the past, is warm enough if you lie close.